I never thought my life would turn into a schedule, where even intimacy would be marked on the calendar like a dentist appointment or a trip to the supermarket for milk. But here I am, 32 years old, married to Andrew for 7 years. And somewhere between his endless work calls and my attempts to keep this marriage afloat, we decided that spontaneity was an overrated luxury. It all started a couple of years ago when I noticed that he and I were no longer the kind of people who could snap out of it in the middle of the night and go for a drive through the empty streets of Los Angeles laughing at stupid billboards. Instead, we became a couple who planned everything: dinners, weekends, even sex. At first it seemed logical. We both have busy schedules. I work as a freelance graphic designer. He's a manager at some tech company where everyone wears the same gray polos and talks about synergy. We decided that making time for intimacy would somehow bring back the spark. Thursday, 9 p.m. After he's finished sorting through his endless spreadsheets and I've set aside my tablet with another project. Sounds romantic, right? Well, at first I tried to convince myself it was normal. I'd even bought new lingerie, black, lacy, what he'd once called a damn hot. Back in the early days of our relationship, that first scheduled night, I lit candles, put on some soft jazz playlist, trying to make it not so mechanical. Andrew came home, as always, with the slight smell of coffee and office air conditioning, dropped his briefcase by the door and smiled at me with that tired smile of his that had long since replaced his former mischievous look. We went through all the steps: kissing, undressing, bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was like rehearsing a play where we'd both forgotten our roles. Everything felt right, but not alive. I lay there afterwards, staring at the ceiling while he fell asleep next to me, and I thought, is this forever? Over time, it became routine. Thursday, sometimes Saturday, if he didn't have deadlines and I didn't have a headache from endless client edits. I started to notice how we both prepared for it like we were preparing for a business meeting. He'd shower, I'd check to make sure my hair wasn't mussed, and we'd silently do what we thought spouses should do. But somewhere inside me, something began to smolder: not anger, not resentment, just fatigue, tired of no longer feeling wanted, but just comfortable. I tried to talk to him about it, but Andrew just shrugged and said something like, "Life is life, Caitlin. We can't be teenagers forever." And I nodded, because he was right, but so wrong at the same time that I wanted to scream. About a year after starting this schedule, I caught myself fantasizing about other things during our meetings. Not about other men, no, but about how great it would be to just get up, put on my trainers and go for a walk in the city at night, alone, without a plan. Or how cool it would be to give up everything and fly somewhere where no one knows my name. I began to notice that my thoughts were increasingly running away from reality. From this bed with the blanket perfectly tucked in. From this house in the suburbs where even the neighbors were on a schedule. Dog walking at 7 o'clock, jogging at 8 o'clock. Andrew, of course, didn't notice anything. He stopped noticing much of anything at all. How I started to be quiet more often at dinner. How I stopped asking him how his day was. How I once just left dirty dishes in the sink, even though it used to drive me crazy. And then there was that evening in early March when everything started to fall apart. Even though I didn't know it was the end yet. It was a Thursday, naturally. And I was sitting on the couch with my laptop, finishing another logo for a client who wanted something minimalistic but with a wow effect. Andrew came home later than usual, with a kind of strange expression on his face that I first mistook for tiredness. He tossed his keys on the front table, walked to the kitchen, poured himself some water, and just stood there looking out the window. I asked if everything was okay, but he just nodded and said he was going to take a shower. And that's when I felt it, not just tiredness, but something more, like the air in the house felt heavier. I closed my laptop, put it aside, and went to get him, but he'd already closed the bathroom door, and the sound of the water drowned out all my thoughts. We spent that evening as usual, on schedule, but something was wrong. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I felt like he was somewhere far away, not with me. Later, when he was asleep, I lay awake, staring at his back, and for the first time in a long time I thought, what if I just left? Not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but right now. Just get up, pack my bag and leave. No plan, no schedule, and that thought, so simple and so frightening, stuck in me like a splinter. I didn't know then that this was just the beginning, that soon everything would change, and an unplanned divorce would be my salvation. But at that moment, I just lay there, listening to his breathing, and realized that I didn't want to live on a schedule anymore. After that night in March, something in me broke. But not in a bad way, more like a shell cracked and I started to see the light outside. I didn't leave right away. Of course, that would have been too easy, too dramatic for the Caitlin I'd become over the years. Instead, I began to notice more and more cracks in my and Andrew's life. The morning after that strange Thursday, I got up before him, made coffee, and sat in the kitchen looking out into the backyard where the grass was already starting to turn yellow from the spring sun. He came down later, wearing his usual gray t-shirt he wore at home, and silently poured himself some cereal. I looked at him and thought, when did we stop talking? Not just exchanging phrases like, did you buy milk? Or, I have a meeting tomorrow, but actually talking? I tried to remember, but there was only noise in my head, the white noise of our routine. As the days went by, I began to experiment with this new, still unformed freedom of mine. At first it was little things. I stopped making the bed right after we got up, leaving the blanket crumpled like some sort of silent protest. Andrew didn't notice, or didn't care. Then I started missing our scheduled evenings. The following Thursday, I said I had an urgent deadline and went to work at a coffee shop a couple of blocks away. Sat there until midnight, drinking cinnamon lattes and drawing something meaningless in my sketchbook, just lines, circles, spots. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was breathing. When I got home, he was asleep, and I didn't feel a twinge of guilt. It was strange not to feel guilty for choosing me. After a couple of weeks, I realized I couldn't pretend anymore. It wasn't just a midlife crisis or marriage fatigue, it was the realization that I was suffocating. I started to notice how Andrew was staying late at work more and more often, how his phone started vibrating more often in the evenings, how he avoided looking me in the eye for longer than a couple of seconds. I didn't ask what was going on, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I almost didn't care anymore. One night, when he came in late again, I was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, watching some stupid vampire show. He walked by, through his usual "I'm tired, I'm going to bed," and I suddenly said into the void, "I'm tired, too." He didn't hear it, or pretended not to, but it was a point of no return for me. The next day I went to my friend Sarah's house. She lived in the center, in a small flat overlooking the skyscrapers, and she was always the one who told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. I told her everything, about my schedule, about how I felt like a piece of furniture in my own home, about how I didn't want to take it anymore. She listened, poured me more wine, and said, "Caitlin, you don't have to live like you're doing time." And that's when I said it out loud for the first time, "I want a divorce." It was like exhaling after a long breath hold. Sarah wasn't surprised, just nodded and asked what I was going to do next. I didn't know, and that was the beautiful thing, I didn't know, and I didn't need to know right now. I spent the next few days putting myself back together piece by piece. I started looking for a flat, even though I hadn't told Andrew anything concrete yet. I just opened websites with adverts, imagining myself living alone in some loft with big windows, where no one would dictate to me when to go to bed or get up. I even started painting again, not for clients, but for myself. Some weird abstract things, full of bright colors that were sorely lacking in my gray life. Andrew seemed to sense something was wrong, but didn't ask. Maybe he was tired too. Maybe he wanted to get out too, but didn't know how. And then there was that night when it all came crashing down. It wasn't Thursday. It wasn't Saturday, just a normal Tuesday. Nothing special. I was cooking dinner, just pasta and sauce from a can, because I was too lazy to come up with something complicated. He came home, sat down at the table and suddenly said, "We need to talk." I froze with a spoon in my hand, feeling my heart start to beat faster. He didn't look like his usual self, not tired, but somehow determined. And then he said it, "I've met someone." There was no screaming, no tears. I just stood there and listened to him talk about a colleague from the office, about how it happened on its own, about how he didn't mean to hurt me. I should have felt hurt, I guess, or angry, but instead I felt relieved, like someone had finally taken off the heavy backpack I'd been dragging around for years. I didn't make a scene, I just nodded and said, "Okay, then I'm out of here." He looked at me like he couldn't believe I was so calm, but I didn't want to waste any more energy on drama. That night I packed my bag, not much, just the essentials, clothes, laptop, toothbrush. I left my keys on the table and left for Sarah's. When I closed the door of our house behind me, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I felt light, free, alive. The divorce hadn't been planned, it had just happened. like rain on a clear day, and I was glad I hadn't brought an umbrella. The first few days after leaving Andrew were like a dream you have on the verge of waking up. Everything is a little blurry, but so real that you want to stay in that state longer. I woke up on Sarah's couch, wrapped in an old floral patterned blanket that smelled like her lavender laundry conditioner. The morning was quiet, with only cars honking somewhere in the distance, and I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I felt. There was no panic, no regret, just a strange, almost forgotten sense of freedom. I got up, made coffee in her little coffee maker, and sat by the window, looking out at the skyscrapers that glistened in the morning light. Sarah had gone to work, leaving me a note: do whatever you want, but don't sit around like a ghost all day, and I decided I wouldn't. The first thing I did was to look for a flat. It wasn't that I had a lot of money, freelancing gave me enough to live on, but not lavishly, and Andrew and I hadn't shared our savings yet. I opened my laptop and started flipping through the listings, choosing something not far from the center, where life was boiling, not frozen in suburban silence. After a couple of hours, I found an option: a small loft in the Arts District, with brick walls and a huge window overlooking a street of graffiti and coffee shops. The landlord, a bearded guy named Jack, said I could move in a week if I put down a deposit. I said yes, not even thinking about where the money would come from. It was the first decision I'd ever made without looking at anyone else, and it filled me with a kind of childlike excitement. I spent the next few days dealing with the practicalities of divorce. I called the lawyer Sarah had recommended, a woman named Linda, with a sharp voice and a dry sense of humor. She said that since we had no children and the mortgage was almost paid off, it would go quickly, especially if Andrew didn't procrastinate. I texted him a message, short, unemotional: need to meet the lawyers. What time is convenient for you? He replied a couple of hours later, Friday, 2 p.m. And that was it. No questions. No, what's up? I stared at my phone screen and thought how strange it was that the man I'd shared 7 years of my life with was now just a line of text. The meeting with the lawyers went unexpectedly smoothly. We were sitting in Linda's office, in a room with beige walls and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Andrew came in his work suit, slightly rumpled and looking like he hadn't slept in a couple of days. His solicitor, some dapper bloke called Marcus, spoke for him while we signed the papers. The house was left to him. I didn't want to go back to those walls where everything was on a schedule. I took my car, half my savings, and a couple of boxes of stuff he'd bring to Sarah's later. When it was over, we walked outside and he suddenly said, "I'm sorry, Caitlin." I looked at him, at his tired eyes, at the wrinkles I hadn't noticed before, and just nodded. "Good luck to you," I said, and walked away. That was the last time I saw him. A week later, I moved into my loft. Jack helped me carry boxes in and then left, leaving me alone in an empty space with bare walls and echoing footsteps. I bought a mattress, a couple of chairs at a crossroads, and an old lamp from the flea market for 20 quid. It didn't feel like home in the usual sense, but I liked it. I started to settle into the place in my own way, hanging up my drawings, putting a pot of cactus on the windowsill that I named Spike. In the evenings I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching passers-by and listening to the noise of the city. Sometimes I would paint until midnight. Other times I would just lie on my mattress and think about how strange it was that I no longer knew what would happen tomorrow. I started to rediscover myself. I signed up for a ceramics course I'd been wanting to try for ages. And every Wednesday I molded crooked mugs to give to Sarah. I went to coffee shops where no one knew my name and sat there for hours, reading books or just staring out the window. Once I even went to a concert by a local indie band I'd heard about from a flyer on the street. I stood in the crowd, feeling the bass from the guitar echoing in my chest, and thought, this is what I was missing, a life without a plan. Andrew wrote occasionally, short messages like, "Did you pick up your jumper?" or, "The check came to your old address." I replied just as briefly, and gradually it died down. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he was living with that coworker, and it didn't bother me. I had my own life, a new, unplanned one, and I finally felt like it was mine. Divorce was not the end, but the beginning, and every day I learned to be happy that I was no longer living on a schedule. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time it didn't scare me, it inspired me. It's been almost a year since I left that house where every step was timetabled, and now, looking back, I realize it was the best thing that ever happened to me. My loft in the Arts District had become more than just a place to sleep, it had become my nook, where everything was just the way I wanted it. The brick walls were now decorated not only with my drawings, but also with a couple of shelves of books I'd bought at Crossroads and a few clay pots I'd made on a ceramics course. Spike, my cactus, had grown and even bloomed once, which I considered a personal victory. I bought an old sofa with mustard-colored upholstery and a small table, where I now drank coffee in the mornings, looking out at the street, which was never quiet. Life without a schedule was not as chaotic as I feared. It was vibrant. I worked when I wanted, sometimes until dawn if the project was exciting, and sometimes I took a day off in the middle of the week just to walk around the city. I started friendships with people I met by chance, a bartender at a coffee shop named Tony who always added an extra shot of cinnamon to my drink, a girl named Mia who studied ceramics with me and loved to tell stories about her travels. Sarah remained my anchor, and we would often meet at her place or mine, drinking wine and laughing about how I almost burned down the kitchen trying to bake a cake. Andrew completely disappeared from my life. The last text from him came a couple of months ago, something about an insurance policy that needed to be renewed. I replied, and that was it. Occasionally I'd hear from people I knew that he was still with that coworker, that they'd moved to another state, but it was like news of someone I'd known in another life. He was no longer a part of my story, and that didn't cause any pain or relief, just a fact, like the sun rising in the morning. One day, at the beginning of spring, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop, drawing in my notebook and listening to Tony arguing with someone about whether it was better to have a cold brew or an espresso. It was raining lightly outside the window and I suddenly realized I was happy. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but quietly, deeply, as if this feeling had been growing inside me all this time without me noticing. I put the pencil away, finished my latte, and walked home in the rain without opening the umbrella that was in my bag. My hair was wet, my trainers were soaked, but I walked and smiled because I could, because it was my choice. That night I stood at the window in the loft for a long time, looking out at the wet streets and the lights that reflected in the puddles. I thought about how things might have been if I'd stayed in that marriage, on that schedule. Maybe we would have gotten a dog, or moved to a bigger house, or continued to be silent over dinner as the years passed us by. But I left, and that decision led me here, to a life where I didn't know what would happen tomorrow, and I loved it. The ending of my story was not grandiose. There was no wedding to a new man, no sudden wealth or moving to another country. It was just a moment when I realized that I no longer had anything to prove, not to myself or anyone else. I sat on my mustard sofa, cup of tea in hand, listened to the rain and thought, this is freedom. Unplanned, imperfect, mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to change anything.